Welcome, everyone. It is so good to be back, bringing you my limited guide for murders at Karlov Manor. For those of you just now joining us, my name is War Crimes Uwu, your choice F&M draft grinder. And every time a set comes out, I like to do one of these little numbers where we go through all of the most important facets of the limited format in my mind. And we sort of talk about the set from the perspective of pre-release and draft. Now, this is not a guide where we go over every single card, but it's sort of the most important things. If somebody has time to watch one video before their pre-release or before their first F&M draft, I want it to be this. So we talk about the best commons and uncommons in each color. We talk about all the draft archetypes, everything like that. And without further ado, let's discuss the table of contents, as it were. For this video. First, we're going to discuss new and returning mechanics, explain those mechanics to you so you can get a feel for them. Then we're going to talk about the best commons and uncommons by color, the limited archetypes, the best rare and mythic bombs, just so you know what to look out for, and tips and tricks for the limited format, where we give a discussion to some of the things that maybe didn't fit cleanly into another part of the video, but that I think are vital to understanding the format. Before we get into it, I just want to ask y'all, if you don't mind, go ahead and give me a subscribe, maybe hit me with a like, a share, whatever you would like to do to improve this video's reach if you feel like this guide is helpful at the end. But without further ado, let's talk about new and returning mechanics. So first we've got a returning mechanic, and one of my personal favorites just because I love the way that it extends games of limited and offers interesting choices, and that mechanic is investigate, or of course clues broadly. So investigate is a keyword mechanic where you make a clue, and a clue is a token, it's an artifact token, that you can at any time pay 2 and sacrifice to draw a card. Think of that as akin to like a treasure or a food or, a blood, similar to that, right? It's a small artifact that you can activate once, and in this case what it does is draw a card, which is obviously quite powerful. Here we've also got knife, that's part of a cycle of clue equipment that are equipments but also clues. And typically the way that you want to look at investigate is, it adds a little bit of icing on the cake of whatever card it's on, right? It's not the same as just drawing a card, but it lets you pay some mana to draw a card later. And as you'll see as we navigate our way through the limited archetypes for this set, investigate and those clue tokens will definitely play a role in some of them. Some synergies around drawing a second card in your turn, or sacrificing artifacts. The next returning mechanic is split cards. Now, to be clear, there are only 5 split cards in this set. There's just a cycle of them. They don't have fuse, so you can only cast one of them, but you get to cast whichever half of the split spell you want when you cast it. So we've got push and pull, fuss and bother, hustle and bustle. Usually it's 2 relatively situational spells that are made more valuable together by the fact that you're able to choose which one is relevant to the particular situation you might be in. So look out for those. If you see them, just know you can cast one half of them, whichever half you want when you cast them. Next, we've got a new-ish mechanic, and I say it's new-ish because it's sort of a riff on an existing mechanic. If you remember Morph from originally from Onslaught, but more recently in Khans of Tarkir, which was actually on Arena, available to draft recently, you can see this is kind of like that, where essentially you're casting the card face down for 3 as a 2/2, and you can turn it up face up at any time for its disguise cost, which will differ based on the card. The only difference is here that when the creature is face down, it has Ward 2, which gives it a little bit of safety in terms of keeping it alive long enough to flip it. Now, it is important to note, disguise is a special action, not instant speed, something even less respondable to than instant speed. As soon as you pay the disguise cost, your opponent does not get to respond, you just turn the creature up immediately, which means you cannot pay to flip up your disguise creature and then they try to kill it in response with something that does 2 damage. So, important to remember that. But above all else, disguise is a mechanic that allows you to sort of surprise your opponent in the middle of combat by flipping your thing up, or maybe some of these creatures have a particular bonus that happens when you flip them up, or they are cheaper to cast down and then flip up rather than cast for their normal mana cost. So a lot of different ways that the disguise mechanic can be used, and I'll have a very important tip for you regarding the disguise mechanic once we get into the tips and tricks, so make sure to stick around for that. And next we've got another new-ish mechanic, and this one's Cloak. Now what's crazy is there's literally only one card at common or uncommon with Cloak, and that's this Expose the Culprit here. The rest of them are all rares and mythics. And essentially what Cloak does is it basically disguises a card from somewhere else that doesn't actually have disguise natively on the card. And then you can flip it up for its cost if it's a creature. This isn't going to come up that often, and I believe, yeah, the Cloak reminder text is on every single card with Cloak. But basically, it just lets you get a card face down, and if it's a creature, you can flip it up for its cost later. And of course, while it's face down, it is a 2/2 with Ward 2. Next, we've got a new mechanic, Suspected. Now, Suspected is not super complicated. If a creature is suspected, it just means it has menace, and it can't block. And this serves, obviously, two functions. Suspected on your creatures in a more aggressive deck is going to make it harder for them to block. Suspected on their creatures, also, ideally in an aggressive deck, is going to make it so that you can get in for damage more easily. In addition to that, there are a good amount of suspected synergy cards. So this middle one here, Clandestine Meddler. 3 mana, 3/2, when it comes in, you can suspect another creature you control. And whenever one or more suspected creatures you control attack, surveil one. So you'll want to look out for cards that have some sort of synergy with suspected. But usually it's just a little extra something that makes it easier to get in damage if you're playing aggressively. Next, we've got another new mechanic, Collect Evidence. Now, Collect Evidence is actually a cost, similar to maybe the Bargain mechanic that we saw in Wilds of Eldraine. Essentially, in additional cost to cast a spell, or sometimes as a cost to activate an ability, you have to collect evidence X. And what collect evidence X means is you exile cards with that total mana value or greater from your graveyard. So all the cards I've shown on screen here have collect evidence 6. So if you want to pay that bonus cost for them, you'll have to exile cards that cost a total of 6 or greater from your graveyard to get that bonus effect. Sometimes the creature will be bigger, sometimes you'll get a bigger effect from your spell. There's even a rare that has a ward cost that's collect evidence, so your opponent has to do it in order to target them. But if you're looking to make a deck in Limited that takes advantage of this mechanic, you're going to want to fill it up with ways to fill the graveyard. Another new mechanic, we've got Cases. Now, these kind of look like sagas or classes, and they play a little bit similarly. It is an enchantment subtype. And essentially the way that a case works is it'll have one effect that it always has. In the case of the Trampled Garden, when this case enters the battlefield, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures you control. And then the middle text box will have its solve condition. So if you meet the solve condition, you solve it at the beginning of your end step. So for this one, it's creatures you control have total power 8 or greater. So if you have 8 power worth of creatures on the battlefield at the beginning of your end step, you will solve this case. And then once the case is solved, it gains the final ability. In this case, whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until end of turn. So what these cases will do is they'll essentially be one spell when they come in, a condition you have to meet, a hoop to jump through, and then right at the end, you will gain some sort of bonus effect. Some of the cases sacrifice themselves in order to do their bonus effect. Some of them are a continuous thing, like in the case of the Trampled Garden. But basically, you're just trying to unlock the second ability by meeting the solve condition. One thing I would say is don't really evaluate these on their solve conditions unless you feel like their solve condition is basically free. Because you look at these kind of like planeswalkers, right? You wouldn't evaluate a planeswalker based on its ultimate. You would evaluate a planeswalker based on the things it's reasonably going to be able to do in a game. And the thing that a case is guaranteed to do is just its enters the battlefield trigger. So I'd focus your analysis on that and just see the solved condition as a little bonus that you don't really use when you're evaluating the case. So now that we've looked at these returning and new mechanics, which are very exciting, I'm very excited for the return of clues, I'm very excited for this new case subtype. Now that we've looked at those, we're going to look at the best commons and uncommons by color, so you can know what to look out for in your sealed pool or when you're doing your first draft. So the best commons I've chosen for white are interesting. We've got Makeshift Binding first, 2 and a white. When Makeshift Binding enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Makeshift Binding leaves the battlefield. You gain 2 life. So this is a Banishing Light, but it has to be used on creatures. Now, I'd say probably 80% of the time or more in Limited, you are using a Banishing Light on creatures anyway. So it comes with the rider of you gain 2 life, which is pretty nice. Next we've got Auspicious Arrival, which is 1 and a white for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Investigate. So I'm a big combat trick hater. I'm pretty low on combat tricks compared to the broader limited playing population. But if the combat trick can replace itself, I'm going to feel a little bit better about spending my mana on something that doesn't necessarily contribute to the board state except by saving my creature in a trade. So I'm happy with Auspicious Arrival because it makes that clue token. And then we've got Due Diligence. Auras also are typically a dangerous ask to play in Limited because they allow you to get 2 for 1. But I think the rate on this is just so good. It's 2 and a white for an Aura, enchant creature. When Due Diligence enters the battlefield, target creature you control other than enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and gains Vigilance until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has Vigilance. So, in a go wide sort of aggressive strategy or just as a push to end the game, this is putting a lot of power immediately on the board ready to attack in the form of a buff to creatures that don't have summoning sickness. And some of that gets to stick around and gets to block, which I think makes Due Diligence a powerhouse of a common. Next, we've got the best white uncommons, and we're going to start with Krovad Haunch, and this one is a little bit more of a bet on my part. I'm not 100% sure this will be good, but I'm looking at it, and it's got too much text to be bad, right? Single white for an artifact, food, equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0. You can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice Krovad Haunch. You gain 3 life. When Krovad Haunch is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a white. If you do, create 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens. And this equips for 2. So the way that I see it, it's an equipment. It's a sort of a Bone Splitter style equipment where it gives 2 power, right? But if you are out of creatures to put it on and it's just sitting there as a useless equipment, you can crack it, gain 3 life, make 2 dogs. There are a lot worse things to be doing in the later game. So I think this will find its way into plenty of white decks. Essence of Antiquity is the next one. Now this is 3 and double white, so 5 mana, for a 1/10 Golem. With Disguise, 2 and a white. So you can, again, play it face down as a 2/2 with Ward 2, and you can turn it up for 2 and a white. And when it's turned up, creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Untap them. A lot of opportunities to blow your opponent out with this if they're not careful. And then we've got Case of the Gateway Express. 1 and a white. When this case enters the battlefield, choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. To solve, 3 or more creatures attacked this turn. Solved, creatures you control get +1/+0. So this case will be easier to solve than others, so you can kind of count that solved option as a real part of the card. But even if you don't, that removal is pretty solid. You have 2-3 creatures out, you can hit something with 2 or 3 toughness and kill it. You have a Death Touch creature out, that creature's automatic. You can kill whatever you want from your opponent's side because, it's your creatures actually dealing the damage here. So, a lot of hidden utility here. But I think it's just a very solid removal spell in a deck that's trying to push aggro that then gives you a reward for doing so. Next, we're going to talk about the best blue commons, and I'm going to be honest with you, this was rough. Blue seems a little bit lacking in the area of commons, but we'll talk about Behind the Mask, an instant for a blue. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may collect Evidence 6. Until end of turn, target artifact or creature becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/3. If evidence was collected, it has base power and toughness 1/1 until end of turn instead. So you can make one of your creatures bigger as a combat trick, make one of their creatures smaller as a combat trick. In a world where a lot of face-down disguise creatures are trading, I think Behind the Mask will be very helpful because obviously a 4/3 takes your disguise creature from a 2/2 to a 4/3 for 1 mana. Trades with theirs, yours survives. In a world where 2/2 is by far the most important power and toughness number, because so many of the creatures in the set have disguise, a combat trick that just makes something a 4/3 for a single blue is going to be a lot more valuable than you'd normally think. Then we've got Bubble Smuggler, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 octopus fish, disguise for 5 and a blue, so it costs 6 to flip up. But as it's turned face up, you put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. So essentially this spell has some modality. You've got a 2 mana 2/1, or you can play it face down for 3 and then flip it up later for 6 and get a 6/5. Much more reasonable, especially when you can do that at instant speed and maybe get win a combat off of it. And then last, we've got Cold Case Cracker. I don't know why they removed Tribal and Totem, but felt it was acceptable to put that in a card name. But Cold Case Cracker is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 Spirit Detective with flying. When Cold Case Cracker dies, investigate. Create a clue token. It's an artifact with 2. Sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. So you look at a set, and you look at sort of the Pizza Rhino of the set, so to speak, a middlingly costed creature that draws a card. You go back to Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we're thinking of the Echo, the Didact Echo, the 5 mana 3/2 draw card, and it conditionally has flying. And I think this kind of fits into that role, right? It's a detective, which does matter to an extent in the set. It makes a clue token, which matters for a couple of the archetypes. So it's going to be filling roles throughout decks, but you're never too sad to be playing a 4 mana 3/3 flyer, although you don't feel great about it. But the clue being left behind after it dies is definitely a big deal. Next, we've got the best uncommons in blue. We've got Sudden Setback, 2 and double blue for an instant. The owner of target spell or non-land permanent puts it on the top or bottom of their library. That can be pretty good. Non-land permanent or spell gives you a lot of flexibility. It can answer a creature before they even get the ETB out of it. You can basically be time walking them with this spell. And then you've got Agency Outfitter, 4 and double blue for a 4/3 Sphinx Detective with flying. When Agency Outfitter enters the battlefield, you may search your your graveyard, hand, and or library for a card named Magnifying Glass and or a card named Thinking Cap, and put them onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle. So we're going to give this card its own little window later in the video where we talk about what those other 2 cards do. But this is essentially kind of a fun draft build-around that I think can have a lot of power in the right deck. And then we've got Exit Specialist, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 human detective. Exit Specialist can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. Disguise, 1 and a blue. When Exit Specialist is turned face up, return another target creature to its owner's hand. So this can just be a creature that's easy to get in on gummed up board states late in the game, and it also can be a huge tempo play if you're able to flip up its Disguise for 2. You can curve this like playing it on turn 3 and then on turn 4, flipping up its Disguise and paying the ward to bounce your opponent's Disguise creature. That's an example of something you could do with Exit Specialist. So just all of the text on there adds up to make a pretty solid card with a few different options. Next, we're going to talk about the best commons in black. Now, 2 of these are removal spells. We're looking at Murder, 1 and double black for an instant. Destroy target creature. Classic spell, very simple. Worth noting that if you want to murder a face-down Disguise creature, you're going to have to pay 5 mana, including the ward, which is very rough. But, all the same, 3 mana for an instant speed, destroy target creature. Always happy to have it. And we've got Slice from the Shadows. Now, this one's interesting. This is X and a black for an instant. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, but this spell can't be countered. Now, we were talking about that ward ability just a second ago with Murder, and there's actually reminder text on here that this includes the ward ability, right? So, you can pay 3 mana and get rid of your opponent's face-down Disguise creature. So there's a lot of utility in this spell being unable to be countered. It scales well into the later game. As long as you have 1 more mana than the creature has toughness, you can answer it at instant speed. And then we've got Repeat Offender, 1 and a black for a 2/1 human assassin. And for 2 and a black, if Repeat Offender is suspected, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Otherwise, suspect it. So the first time that you pay for this, you're just going to get to suspect it. But every time after that, you can pay 3 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature at instant speed. And that feels pretty good. You look at Toadstool Admirer from Wilds of Eldraine, and that card was a lot better than it looked in that format. And this puts counters on itself for a little cheaper. Now, granted, it of course does not have Ward 2, and once you suspect it, it can no longer block. But it does have Menace. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was a very, very solid 2-drop in black, and so I've put it as one of its best commons. Next, we'll talk about the best uncommons in black. First, we've got Leering Onlooker. Now, boy, is this card good. This is 1 and a black for a 1/3 vampire with flying. And then for 2 and double black, You can exile Leering Onlooker from your graveyard to create 2 tapped 1/1 black bat creature tokens with flying. Yeah, I mean, I think this card is very solid in an obvious way. A 1/3 flyer for 2 is very fine and limited, and then late in the game you can make some flying tokens off of it. Worth noting, one of the archetypes in this set is 2 or less power matters, and this card by itself is essentially 3 creatures with 2 or less power to trigger all of your effects that care about that. Next, we've got Soul Enervation, 3 and a black for an enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So you're primarily looking at this for the removal spell, which is -4/4 for 4 at flash, at instant speed, which is very solid. And then you just have the additional rider of maybe you're collecting evidence later in the game, or you're doing something else that removes a creature from your graveyard. That's another one of the archetypes we're going to look at later. And you just get to drain your opponent. That feels very solid. And then we've got Long Goodbye. They really wanted to center the set around the disguises, as you can tell by all these removal spells that have this spell can't be countered. Long Goodbye is 1 and a black for an instant, can't be countered. Destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. Now, of course, a disguised creature doesn't have a mana value, it has a mana value of 0. So unless they flip it up in response and it has more than 3 mana value, then this doesn't work, right? But hopefully you're going to cast it when they don't have a way to flip up their creature. And then it can't be countered, just destroys it cleanly. So Long Goodbye is definitely going to be one to look out for. Now we're going to talk about the red commons. We're going to start with Person of Interest. It is 3 and a red for a 2/2 human rogue. When Person of Interest enters the battlefield, suspect it. Create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. So this seems like a lot of bang for your buck. It's 4 mana for a 2/2 menace that can't block, and then just a 2/2. And in a game where you're going to be constantly trying to trade for your opponent's 2/2s in the form of their disguised creatures, it's just good to have 2 2/2s. Not to mention the suspected synergy and the detective synergy. Next we've got Shock. Now this is obviously a reprint. It's a classic Magic card. This is another way to sort of pay 3 mana to deal with your opponent's thing that they paid 3 mana for, their disguised creature. Because Shock is 1 mana for 2 damage to any target at instant speed. So, of course, if you're paying the ward, that's going to be 3 mana, the same amount that they spent on it. And you feel fine making that trade, broadly speaking. But yeah, Shock is just useful to have. And then we've got Galvanize, 1 and a red, deals 3 damage to target creature. It's an instant. If you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, Galvanize deals 5 damage to that creature instead. So if you're using it on your turn and you've cracked a clue token, then this is 5 damage for 2 mana, which is very, very solid. You're very happy to see these and have them sort of be your primary mode of removal in red. Now we're going to talk about the best red uncommons. First, we've got Torch the Witness, X and a red. Torch the Witness deals twice X damage to target creature. If excess damage was dealt to that creature this way, investigate. So this lines up sort of awkwardly with the ward tokens, right? Including the ward, you're going to have to pay a total of 4 mana to kill one of them with it, and you won't get that token. But against anything else, normal creatures, you're not going to have to pay that much mana to both get rid of the creature and get that clue token, which is going to put you ahead on card advantage, something that's really going to matter in what I believe to be a slower format like this one. So Torch the Witness is premium removal in red. And then we've got a Case of the Burning Masks, 1 and double red. When this case enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. To solve, 3 or more sources you controlled dealt damage this turn. Solved, sacrifice this case, exile the top 3 cards of your library. Choose one of them, you may play that card this turn. So looking at this right off the bat, right, it's 3 mana for 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. That's passable. But if you have dealt damage with 3 or more sources this turn, doesn't say what kind of sources, doesn't say to what, that can be killing their creature with this first ability and then hitting them in the face with 2 creatures you attack with, then you have solved this case, and then for the rest of the game you have the ability to just sack this. You're going to want to obviously do it on your turn because it only lets you cast the thing you got this turn, and just get the best card out of the top 3 cards of your library. So it's a card that gives you a removal spell basically on rate, and then some card advantage. I think this card's going to be awesome. And then we've got Reckless Detective. This This guy is 1 and a red for an 0/3 Devil Detective. Whenever Reckless Detective attacks, you may sacrifice an artifact or discard a card. If you do, draw a card, and Reckless Detective gets +2/0 until end of turn. I think this card is an insane 2-drop. Just the fact that it's a 2/3 on the attack and lets you rummage or sacrifice your clues for free, essentially, is really, really powerful. This is a really, really great 2-drop for limited, good in aggressive decks, good if you're trying to filter to draw to something, just a really, really solid card to have. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the best commons of green. So first we've got Bite Down on Crime. This is 3 and a green for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect evidence 6. This spell costs 2 less to cast if evidence was collected. So this is sort of like a pseudo-delve, right? You can cast it for 4, or you can cast it for 2 and exile 6 mana worth of stuff from your graveyard. But basically, target creature you control get +2 until end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So this is a bite, or a one-sided fight, that also buffs the creature. Even if you don't have the biggest thing on the field, you're likely going to be able to still kill the biggest thing on the field with this, and then get in for a little extra damage. Just a solid green removal spell to see. And then we've got Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, 1 and a green for a 1/3 elf detective. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect evidence 6. Reach. When Vitu-Ghazi Inspector enters the battlefield, if evidence was collected, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and you gain 2 life. So 2 mana, 1/3 reach, fine, whatever. But the fact that if you are not casting this as a 2-drop, if you're casting it a little bit later in the game and you have the ability to collect that evidence, you can have a 2/4 reach and 2 life for 2 mana. That's pretty great. Or you can put that counter on something else, maybe something that's ready to attack, and then gain 2 life. So just a very solid card. And then we've got Topiary Panther. He's 4 and double green for a 6/5 trample plant cat with basic land cycling, 1 and a green. Now, 2 things I want to note about this. Just a solid sized body. This is definitely the Colossal Dreadmaw of the set. Losing out on a toughness, gaining the basic land cycling. It'll let you splash if you feel like splashing. And also, importantly, almost all of the common and uncommon cards that collect evidence in this set collect evidence 6. And you'll notice that this guy's mana value is exactly 6. So if you basic land cycle him, he can feed one of your collect's evidence spells, like the other 2 we looked at here, just on his own. And then next we've got the best uncommons in green. So we're going to start with hard-hitting questions, which is very simple. It is a single green for a sorcery. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. So comparing this to Cosmic Hunger from March of the Machine, same card. Well, Cosmic Hunger can hit battles which are not in this set, so that's irrelevant. Same card, but it's sorcery speed for 1 less mana. And I would happily lose the sorcery speed to pay 1 less for the effect. So hard-hitting questions is definitely solid. Pompous Gadabout, 2 and a green for a 4/2 human citizen. Pompous Gadabout has hexproof as long as it's your turn, and he can't be blocked by creatures that don't have a name. So what that is referring to is, of course, disguised or cloaked creatures. The hexproof on your turn prevents your opponent from kind of doing anything funny, and then if your opponent only has disguised creatures, he can just get in for free. And he's a 3 mana 4/2, so that's pretty solid. And then we've got Greenbelt Radical. I think there are definitely strategies in this set that are going to want this card more than just a generic deck does, but it is just very solid, even independent of the archetypes that might have specific synergy with it. So it's a 3 and a green Centaur Citizen. It's a 4/4. It is disguised for 5 and double green, which is a huge amount of mana. It costs 7 to flip this thing up. But when Greenbelt Radical is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Creatures you control gain trample until end of turn. This is going to be absolutely devastating in combat. Your opponent does blocks, and then you just flip this guy over. It's immediately a 5/5, and you're buffing all your other stuff and giving it trample. That's going to win a lot of games. Greenbelt Radical, definitely a very solid card. Equally solid on the block, although I think if you're flipping this guy over, you should probably be trying to win the game that turn. So next we're going to talk about the limited archetypes. These are the kinds of decks that were sort of designed to be played based on these signpost uncommons. Now, it is worth noting that this is technically a Ravnica set, although it's not really into the guilds in the way most Ravnica sets are. But there are more multicolored cards than usual. So not every multicolored uncommon is necessarily going to be a signpost uncommon, but I'm going to show you all the signpost uncommons so that you know what to look out for and you know what the archetypes in the set are. So this is the first archetype. Green-white, face down, go wide. So go wide deck, kind of utilizing tokens, utilizing a lot of creatures to sort of go around the opponent and be aggressive. This deck wants to do that and specifically focus on disguise. So we've got Sumala Sentry, which is green and a white for a 1/3 reach elf archer. Whenever a face-down permanent you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it and a +1/+1 counter on Sumala Sentry. So this card's really good with disguise because it'll get bigger, it'll make your disguise guys bigger, it'll ruin the trades in combat, it ruins the rule of 5, which is something we're going to discuss later, that sort of dictates the way that combat between disguised creatures works. But this card is just very solid. And what this archetype is essentially aiming to do is just play face-down creatures, go wide with them, and then flip them up to put your opponent in situations that they would rather not be in after you've jeopardized their life total. Here are some more cards that are going to go in that face-down, go wide deck. This Crowd Control Warden is part of a larger cycle of creatures that are multicolored but can be disguised for only one of their colors, can be flipped up from disguise, for only one of their colors. And this one sort of gets bigger when it enters or is flipped face up based on the number of other creatures you control. So, very much fitting into that go wide strategy. Very crazy as a combat trick to flip it up for 5. And then Nervous Gardener, a disguised creature that grabs lands. Museum Night Watch, a disguised creature that's pretty cheap to flip up, and when it dies, you replaces itself with a 2/2. Next, we're going to talk about the white-blue archetype, Detective Tribal, or Typal. Private Eye is the signpost uncommon. It's 1, a white and a blue, for a 3/3 Homunculus Detective. Other detectives you control get +1/+1, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. So you can target himself, or you can target another detective. But the important thing is he's a detective lord. Now, a lot of the random common and uncommon creatures in this set do just happen to be detectives, so him buffing them is pretty useful. But, the detective deck is also going to care to a degree about clues, which this guy allows you to use to make your guys unblockable. And then, of course, we've got this aura that buffs a creature that has flash, and it buffs a detective, or it turns a non-detective into a 1/1 that can't block detectives. We've got a case here that that rewards you for controlling 3 or more detectives, things like that. And then just some of the good common detectives. Inside Source is a very solid one. Hotshot Investigators, Granite Witness. And that is, again, part of the common cycle of disguised creatures that are multicolored but can be flipped face up for just one of their colors using hybrid mana. Next, we're going to talk about blue-black clue control. So the signpost uncommon for this one is Curious Cadaver. Interesting card. It's 2, a blue and a black for a 3/1 zombie detective with flying. So 4 mana, 3/1 flyer. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, return Curious Cadaver from your graveyard to your hand. So this guy has power and toughness for trading, with your opponent's disguised creatures, with their other flyers, whatever. So you can, if you have a way to consistently create clues, you can use the fact that this guy can repeatedly trade to just disincentivize attacking in the first place, to go 1-for-1 with your opponents and just eventually outvalue them and completely stabilize. And then he's a threat in the air. 3 power every turn, which will close out games. So very powerful signpost uncommon. And then we've got just like this Curious Inquiry. It's sort of a curiosity effect. The creature gets +1/+1, and when they hit a player, you make a clue. We've got this creature that investigates, and then whenever you sack a clue, target opponent gets 2 poison counters, which is cool. Just a lot of options here. You want to be making clues, generating value, eventually stabilizing and winning the game off of just a backbreaking amount of card advantage. And then, of course, we've got some more cards that are either control-oriented or work with clues in some way. That's what blue-black is trying to do here. Next, we've got Black-Red Suspected Matters. So both of these uncommons in this color care about Suspected. We've got Runebrand Juggler, black and a red for a 2/2 human shaman. When it enters the battlefield, suspect up to one target creature you control. And for 5 mana, sacrifice a suspected creature. Target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. So you can suspect a dinky little creature and then use it as a removal spell. You can suspect this guy and then use him as a removal spell. You know, just a sort of a flexible creature. You get in with those suspected creatures, and then if your opponent somehow makes a board state where even Menace is not safe to attack with favorably, you can use it as a removal spell. And then we've got Deadly Complication, 1 a black and a red for a sorcery. Choose one or both. Destroy target creature. Put a +1/+1 counter on target suspected creature you control. You may have it no longer become suspected. So, you can use that to buff a suspected creature and keep it suspected or make it allowed to block. But the important thing here is obviously destroy target creature, which at sorcery speed for 3 is completely fine. And then we've got Convenient Target. It's this sort of aura that lets you repeatedly suspect a creature because it can come back from your graveyard to your hand. It also buffs the creature that it goes on and suspects. You can hear my cat sneezing in the background. Shout out to Athena. And then here's some more Suspected Matters cards. We've looked at all of these before, but Rebel Belt Braggart, Repeat Offender, Person of Interest. Any card that can suspect itself, especially repeatedly if you're maybe unsuspecting it to get some benefit, is very helpful here. And important to note, with these cards, you can suspect your opponent's creatures to make them unable to block to get in damage. Black-Red Suspect is definitely going to be the most aggressive deck in the format. Well, one of the 2 most aggressive decks in the format. We'll get to that later. Red-Green is Big Disguise, so sort of in contrast to what Green-White is trying to do, where they're trying to go wide with disguised creatures, Red-Green is trying to make the largest disguised creatures possible. Flip over a big disguised creature and win the game that way. So we've got, Tin Street Gossip, which is a 4-mana 4/4 Vigilance that taps for a red and a green to spend this mana only to cast face-down spells or to turn creatures face-up. So if you're playing 4 mana, you're already getting into the later-ish parts of the game, so that more mana is going to need to pay for something huge, or at least double spelling in a relevant way. And then Concealed Weapon is a disguise equipment that attaches to something when it flips face up. So maybe you swing with 2 disguised creatures, and if they block the Concealed Weapon, you just flip it and attach it to the creature they didn't block. And then we've got Culvert Ambusher, which is, a big guy that when it enters the battlefield or is turned face up, target creature blocks this turn if able. So you can set up some combats where you definitely get to eat one of your opponent's creatures. And then the common is Riftburst Hellion. It's just a big guy with disguise, so exactly what this deck wants. A guy that Goblin Maskmaker that is really cool to play this on turn 1 and turn 2 swing with it, and then you can disguise something for only 2 mana. Tunnel Tipster, a mana dork that gets bigger with +1/+1 counters the more face-down creatures you play, so very helpful there. Now we're getting into the enemy archetypes, and to be honest, this is the one that I'm most excited to play. This is the Signpost Uncommon that has me the most excited. It's Wisp Drinker Vampire. 2, a white and a black for a 2/4 Vampire Rogue with flying. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And then for 7 mana, 5 a white and a black, creatures you control with power 2 or less gain Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. So not only does she sort of slowly drain your opponent out as you are playing disguised creatures, as you're making little tokens, those 2/2 detective tokens. There are so many creatures with power 2 or less, especially, most importantly, disguised creatures. But if your opponent doesn't deal with this, it's going to kill them in a second way by making you have the best attacks you could possibly have, giving all your creatures Death Touch so that your opponent has to trade with them, and Lifelink so that you're safe to attack with them without really fear of the crackback. Just a really, really powerful card. And then we've got Neighborhood Guardian, a unicorn, where whenever a creature with 2 or less power comes in, you get to buff one of your creatures for the turn. And then Slimy Dual Leech, A 4-mana 2/4 leech at the beginning of combat on your turn. Target creature you control with power 2 or less gets +1/0 and Death Touch until end of turn. So of course it can target itself, but ideally you're going to want to leave this guy up to block and maybe target a smaller creature and make your opponent feel really bad about blocking it because of the Death Touch. And then we've got the common Sanguine Savior, 3 mana for a 2/1 flying lifelink, but you can disguise, flip it up for just 2 white-black hybrid. When Sanguine Savior is turn face up, another target creature you control gains lifelink until end of turn. And then, of course, Inside Source, which we saw earlier, and Snarling Gorehound, which can surveil whenever you play creatures with 2 or less power. So this deck's definitely low to the ground, but I don't think it's as much of an aggro deck as we saw maybe with red-black, or as we're going to see with red-white. I think it is definitely more of like a mid-range deck that can kind of has potential to stall before it ends up killing you with just the really good attacks it can create for itself. We've got black-green, Leave the Graveyard. Insidious Roots, black and a green for an enchantment. Creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. So those plants are going to just keep getting bigger and bigger. So first you get a 1/2, then you get a 2/3 and a 1/2, then you get a 3/4 and a 2/3 and a 1/2, right? Now, realistically, are you going to have creatures leaving your graveyard every turn? Definitely not. But, you do it twice while Insidious Roots is out, and it's crazy. And you can there are some creatures with abilities that exile themselves from your graveyard in these colors, and then, of course, there are cards that collect evidence. And then there's cards that return creatures from your graveyard to your hand. That counts as them leaving your graveyard. They don't have to get exiled. And then Crawl Whipcracker doesn't have anything to do with the leave your graveyard thing. I just think it's a very powerful card. It's a black and a green for a 3/2 Insect Assassin with Reach. And when it enters the battlefield, destroy target token an opponent controls. So most often that's going to be a clue, and you're going to feel fine about that because you've got a 3/2 Reach for 2 as well. You're honestly probably going to feel fine just casting it without anything to destroy. But on the board states where you can blow up a detective token, it's going to feel great. I think this card's great. And then Soul Innervation we talked about, and we'll look here at a few more commons. Notably, Rebel Belt Maverick can remove itself from your graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, which is not a huge ability, but it procs all your things that trigger on leaving the graveyard. Macabre Reconstruction is the Raise Dead of this set. It lets you return creatures from your graveyard to your hand, which is, again, also going to count those Leave the Graveyard synergies. Next, we're talking about green-blue, and their thing is Collect Evidence. Now, this is going to have a lot of overlap with the green-black deck in terms of the green cards, because that deck's going to be looking for cards that collect evidence as a way to have creatures leave the graveyard, naturally. So we've got Evidence Examiner, green and a blue for a 2/2 Merfolk Detective. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4. Exile cards with total mana value 4 or greater from your graveyard, for those who need a refresher on what Collect Evidence is. And whenever you collect evidence, investigate. Create a clue token. So, importantly, this doesn't just proc off of its own ability to collect evidence. So if you have other cards that collect evidence for some other reason, then this guy is going to proc off of those too and give you a clue token. And then Sample Collector, which attacks, when you attack, you collect evidence. You can collect evidence 3 to put a counter on target creature you control. And then Surveillance Monitor, which when it enters the battlefield, you can collect evidence 4, and whenever you collect evidence, importantly not just off of his ability, you get a Thopter. So, you're going to be looking for ways to fill your graveyard so you have fodder with which to actually collect that evidence, and then you're just going to be trying to use that rider as much as possible to get a little extra value. Of course, here's Undercover Crocodile. Doesn't have anything to do with collect evidence, but it's the green-white common. Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, which we talked about, and Crime Stopper Sprite, which we talked about both in the explanation of how the mechanic worked. Now we've got Blue-Red Artifact Sacrifice. Now this one has 2 kind of insane Signpost Uncommons. We've got Detective Satchel, 2 a blue and a red for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, investigate twice. And you can tap to create a 1/1 colorless Thopter with flying. Activate only if you've sacrificed an artifact this turn. So every time you sack a clue, you can tap this baby to make a Thopter. That is really good. This card is just kind of, it's a build around, but it builds around itself when you play it. And then we've got Gleaming Geardrake. 1 and a red for a 1/1 flyer. When Gleaming Geardrake enters the battlefield, investigate. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Gleaming Geardrake. So, even just a 4-mana 2/2 flyer that draws a card is okay. And you can look at it like that, but you can also very much look at it in terms of just, like, late in the game, you have several clues, you're cracking this, you're making it a threat that your opponent just absolutely has to answer. Not to mention, just as a 2-drop, even if they do immediately answer it, you left behind a clue, which not a lot of 2-drops can say. So 2 crazy signpost uncommons for blue-red artifact sacrifice. 90% of the time the artifact you're sacrificing is going to be a clue, but the option is there for other synergies. We can look at these other cards that either care about you sacking artifacts or make artifacts, like this Gadget Technician that makes a Thopter when it enters the battlefield or is flipped face up. An insane common, by the way. And now we've got what I think is the other very aggressive deck in the format, other than Black-Red. This is Red-White Battalion. Now, the reason why I didn't put Battalion in the list of returning mechanics is because they don't actually use the name Battalion when they refer to it in the set. They just say whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures. But for those of you who don't remember, in Return to Ravnica block, and of course there were a few, I think specifically Gatecrash, and then of course there were a few cards reprinted with it in the recent Ravnica Remastered. Basically, it is just cards that care about you attacking with 3 creatures. So we've got Meddling Youths here, 3, a red and a white for a 4/5 human detective with haste. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, investigate. It has haste so that it can hopefully proc itself if you have 2 other good attacks on the turn it comes in and make a clue. And then it's basically an aggro deck. This is kind of your curve topper. You're going to have a lot of 2-drops that can have some alternate way of getting in or some battalion ability of their own. And then Lightning Helix here. Crazy card to see reprinted, really exciting. Classic Magic card. It's a red and a white for an instant, deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. Not necessarily built for the Battalion deck, although obviously removal is good for making sure you can get in with weaker creatures to trigger your battalions. But Lightning Helix is just an insanely powerful card that's going to be an uncommon in this set in red and white, so I thought to mention it here. And then we talked about Case of the Gateway Express earlier. That cares about Battalion. Lots of powerful commons that care about Battalion. This Dog Walker is a 3/1 that if you can flip it over with its disguise, you get 2 1/1 white dogs. And that is sort of just a 1-card battalion, a one-stop shop that will allow you to have 3 creatures to attack with to trigger your battalion effects. Person of Interest is 2 creatures for 1 card, one of which has Menace, so it's likelier to stick around. And then Seasoned Consultant is a 3/3 when it's attacking if you have a battalion, which is really powerful. So those are the limited archetypes. I'm personally most excited to play with black-white, 2 power or less, and blue-red artifacts. Although, a lot of them look really fun to me. The battalion will be fun to see come back. Sound off in the comments. Let me know which archetype you're most excited to play with in this limited format. But while you do that, we're going to begin going over the best bombs in the format. Now, I've selected 6 rares and 3 mythics that I think are the most game-warping, and it's worth noting this set doesn't really feel like it has back-breaking, annoying bombs like some recent sets have. Ixalan was not immune to this. The gods felt pretty awful to play against. And if you looked at, recently the really egregious one was March of the Machine, which had Atali, it had Sunfall, it had just a lot of back-breaking rares. Look at Gruff Triplets in Wilds of Eldraine. This set doesn't seem to have that many busted, really unfun rares and mythics. There's certainly no Dream Trawler in this set. But I have looked at what I think are the most powerful bombs for you to just keep an eye out for. So we're starting with Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, and this card's just great at generating value. It's 1, a white, and a black for a 2/3 legendary human advisor with Death Touch. At the beginning of your end step, investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn. So you're making a clue. if you hit your opponent, if you made them lose life in any way at the beginning of your end step, which is not a hard ask. And then whenever a clue you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. This ability triggers only once each turn. So when you make that clue, you can turn it into a spirit, and then that spirit is going to get in for damage to make another clue. So, this card can get really out of hand if it doesn't get answered. And it's worth noting also, I think removal is just going to be in general not as good in this set because people are going to be having to play it knowing that most of the creatures in the set have Ward 2 by way of disguise. So cards that are maybe a little greedier than you would normally think are going to be better than they normally are. So next we've got Sharp-Eyed Rookie, 1 and a green for a 2/2 human detective with vigilance. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if its power is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's power, or its toughness is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's toughness, put a +1/+1 counter on Sharp-Eyed Rookie and investigate. So this is the long way around saying Evolve, which is a classic, the Simic mechanic from Gatecrash, Return to Ravnica block, where basically when a bigger creature comes in, this creature gets bigger with it. Except you also get to investigate, so a very, very powerful 2-drop. This one's definitely going in my cube. I'm very, very excited to put this one in my cube. I think same with this Aurelia that we're going to talk about next. There's a couple of really cool cube cards in this set. But we've got Aurelia, the Law Above, speaking of. It's a 3, a red and a white for a 4/4 legendary angel with flying, vigilance, and haste. So right off the bat, it's a Serra Angel with haste. But that's not all. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia deals 3 damage to each of your opponents, and you gain 3 life. So very importantly, your opponent's not going to attack with 3 creatures while this is out. Obviously, they're not going to give you a free card unless they can kill you. But if you attack with 3 creatures, which is going to be relatively easy, because if you were already ready to attack with 3 creatures and then you played this card, if you were already ready to attack with 2 creatures, not that big a ask, and then you play this card, which is obviously ready to attack, they're not going to have good blocks for it. It's in the air, and it has haste. You're definitely going to get to draw a card off of it, which is insane. So I think this card will take over games pretty quickly. We got 3 more rares to look at before we get to the mythics. First is Tolsimir Midnight's Light, and I think if there is any rare that is so good it'll be unfun in the format, it is probably Tolsimir. So he's 2, a green, and double white for an Elf Scout, a 3/2 with lifelink. When he enters the battlefield, create Voya Fenstalker, a legendary 5/5 green and white wolf creature token with trample. Whenever a wolf you control attacks, if Tolsimir attacked this combat, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf this combat if able. Rough. 5 mana for a 3/2 lifelink and a 5/5 trample is already just an insane rate. But the fact that if this guy attacks alongside Voya, you can choose one of your opponent's creatures and force them to block Voya is absolutely backbreaking. I think this rare is completely insane, worth pivoting later in a draft for. Especially with the relatively easy fixing of the set. And then we've got Hunted Bone Brute. 2 and a black for a Skeleton Beast. It's a 6/2 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent creates 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens. When Hunted Bone Brute dies, each opponent loses 3 life. Disguise for 1 and a black. So if you haven't figured it out already, the really powerful thing here is that Disguise flips it face up, so it never enters the battlefield as Hunted Bone Brute, and your opponent does not get those 2 dogs. So if you play this as a Disguise, 2/2 for 3, you flip it up for 1 and a black, make it a 6/2 Menace, and then it's all upside from there. It's an incredibly powerful creature. Deals a lot of damage or trades with 2 of their things pretty easily, and then they lose 3 life. Really, really cool. And then we've got Cryptic Coat, which is just going to be a card that's able to grind your opponent out on value. It's 2 and a blue. Whenever Cryptic Coat enters the battlefield, cloak the top card of your library, then attach Cryptic Coat to it. Equipped creature gets +1/0 and can't be blocked, and you can pay 1 and a blue to return Cryptic Coat to its owner's hand. So it's basically a 3 mana 3/2 unblockable. Very solid. If the creature you flip, if the thing you cloaked is a creature, you can flip it for its mana cost, which is very powerful. And whether it is or isn't, you can pay 2 mana to bounce Cryptic Coat to its owner's hand. The creature just sits there as a 2/2. Or whatever you flipped it into, and then you can replay the Cryptic Coat for 3 again and just get another unblockable creature. So Cryptic Coat is both a good creature on rate and also just keeps making more creatures forever, for 5 mana at a time. So very powerful card, very powerful card. And then we're going to talk about 3 very powerful mythics. So we'll start with the Planeswalker of the set, Kaya Spirit's Justice. Kaya is a character I really like. I've loved most of her cards that they've printed. And I think her design, her as like a ghost assassin is really cool. So Kaya Spirit's Justice is 2 a white and a black for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. So a couple things. Basically, we'll put that in English. Whenever you have a creature card go into exile, you can make one of your tokens become a copy of it until end of turn, except it has flying. So one of the big things. So this Planeswalker generates a spirit token, but you can also turn your clue tokens into copies of that creature. So her plus is +2, surveil 2, then exile a card from a graveyard. If your opponent has something particularly problematic in their graveyard, you can get rid of it, or if you just want to stop them from being able to collect evidence. Or you can exile a thing from your graveyard, specifically a creature, and have one of your creatures become a copy. And then her +1, which is just another plus, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. So if you want, you could ignore the rest of the text on this card, and it's just a 4-mana Planeswalker that pluses to make a 1/1 flyer, and that's very solid. But she's also got this -2, exile target creature you control. For each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So, sort of a 1-for-1 sacrifice, except you can also, of course, since your creature was exiled, make your token a copy of it as well. So, card with a ton of text. Just an absolute Yu-Gi-Oh card here. But I think all of that text is pretty solid. You'll be very happy to have access to one of these in Limited. And then we've got Vein Ripper, which is a 6-mana 6/5 flying vampire assassin. Ward, sacrifice a creature. So if your opponent wants to target this and they don't have any creatures, they are SOL. But even if they do, whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So very notable, when this dies. So if your opponent wants to target this with removal that destroys it, not only are they losing 2 and you're gaining 2 off the creature they're sacking to pay the ward, they're also losing 2 and gaining 2 off of the Vein Ripper itself dying. So best case scenario for them, they're removing this immediately. They're going down a creature and getting drained for 4, an 8-point life swing, which is crazy. And if they don't answer this, that's not better for them. It is a 6-mana 6/5 flyer, which is an insane clock. But also, every single time a creature dies, yours or theirs, they're losing 2 and you're gaining 2. Card's crazy. And then our last mythic, Anzrag the Quake Mole. 2 a red and a green, so 4 mana for an 8/4 mole god, legendary. Whenever Anzrag becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. So, if your opponent can't afford to block this unless they can trade with it, right? And if they do trade with it, you're getting an extra combat, you're getting rid of presumably some good creatures they have. And if they can afford to let it through, they're still taking 8 damage. But what's more, if they can afford to let it through, but you don't want them to, you can pay 3 double red and double green. Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn, if able. So then, if they can trade with it, they're forced to. If they can't trade with it, then, you're eating something and then getting in for a whole extra combat. And again, this is a combat with all your creatures, not just another combat for Anzrag. So this card's great. Obviously, 4 mana 8/4, you can get rid of the text, and it's good. But this text is certainly also very powerful. So last but not least, we're going to go over some tips and tricks that I think will help you excel at this format. Just some things that I have picked up in my practice drafts and through just thinking about the format and, some advice that I think you'll find valuable. So really importantly, we're going to talk about the rule of 5. Now, this is something that was present in the design of Khans of Tarkir as well. Basically, the designers wanted to, the morph mechanic, and in this case, the disguise mechanic, inherently comes with some limitations in terms of how skill-based it is. Like, there's such a wide pool of things that could be your opponent's face down, and you want players to feel like they have a chance to correctly guess at least the relevance of their opponent's face down creature, if not the literal exact one that it is. So they instituted something they call the Rule of 5, where basically, if you have two disguised creatures, or morphed creatures, that are in combat with each other, that are face down, 2/2s, right? Then in order for one of them to just win that combat, to eat the other creature, flipping it up has to cost at least 5 mana. So, if the disguise cost on a creature is less than 5, that creature either needs to trade with a 2/2 or bounce off of a 2/2. So a 1/4 or a 3/1, whatever. But it cannot be like a 2/3 or a 4/4 unless it costs 5 or more mana to flip. Which means that's something you'll definitely want to keep in mind in your games of limited. If your opponent doesn't have 5 mana and your 2/2s are against each other, you're safe. Unless they have, obviously, a combat trick, but then they're spending another card. Your opponent will not be able to flip their thing over and just eat your thing unless they have at least 5 mana. So that is a very, very... Like, if you take one thing into playing the set in limited, that's going to be it. That your opponent needs to pay 5 mana in order to eat your creature in a combat between two face downs. Now we're going to talk about, there's a lot of gold cards. Now, it seems like... So in terms of commons and uncommons, each color pair has 2 uncommons. Typically, that's one signpost uncommon that's really trying to show you what the archetype is about, in this case, Wisp, Drinker, Vampire, and then one just normal uncommon, in this case, Soul Search. It's a sort of duress variant that has a chance to make a spirit if you discard something that costs 1 or less. So typically, yeah, it'll be one. The uncommons will be one signpost and one regular, although that's not always the case. Red-blue, for example, just has 2 very powerful signpost uncommons. And then every color pair has at common a disguise creature that can be flipped up. Its disguise cost has hybrid mana. So the Sanguine Savior, for instance, I would get the most use out of in a black-white deck because I can hardcast it if need be. But if I'm talking about a deck that's only using black or only using white, I can play it just as a disguise if I decide that that rate is acceptable to me. So, worth noting, this is a set that's going to encourage a splash a little bit. You're just going to see a lot more gold cards than you do in a normal set. So be aware of that, and know that not every uncommon you look at is necessarily going to be the signpost uncommon nudging you toward an archetype. Only the ones that we talked about here in this video. And then this is a trick, this is part of my tips and tricks, where you're going to want to sort of evaluate cards against disguised creatures. And what I mean by that is, there's seldom a limited set where most of the creatures on the board are going to be the same. But when you look at this set, a large amount of the creatures on the board are going to be the face-down disguised creature, which is a 2/2 with Ward 2. Now, what that means is that savvy players are going to be able to read cards and evaluate them against the thing they are most likely to be running up against. So you look at Shock, that is a good card, but a little not as good in this format as it might be in other formats, because the thing that is most designed to kill, you still do have to pay 3 mana to kill, rather than 1. Long Goodbye, on the other hand, is better, because it can answer a face-down creature without having to pay the ward cost. And then you look at Harried Dronesmith, and it actually took me a while to scroll through to find a 2/3 creature in this set, and that's for an obvious reason. If most of the creatures in the set are 2/2s in the form of these face-down ward creatures, a 2/3 is insane. So this Harried Dronesmith, it makes a Thopter at the beginning of combat on your turn, and then you sack it, which is great, obviously, especially in decks where that's synergistic. But one of the big draws of it is just that it's a 2/3, so it's a really good blocker against disguised creatures. So think about cards in the frame of how do they tussle with a 2/2 with Ward 2. And that will help you evaluate the cards in this format. And this format is going to be very complicated. There's a lot of text on these cards. These mechanics interact in a weird way. So just keep that sort of thing in mind. And then we're going to talk about Slime Against Humanity real quick. This is 2 and a green for a sorcery. Create a 0/0 green ooze with trample. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is 2 plus the total number of cards you own in exile and in your graveyard that are oozes or are named Slime Against Humanity. A deck may have any number of cards named Slime Against Humanity. I don't think you will be able to get enough copies of this card in Limited for it to matter at all. Even if you have this making a 4/4 by having cast 2 Slime Against Humanities already, that means that the first 2 Slime Against Humanities were a 3-mana 2/2 and a 3-mana 3/3. And a 5/5 feels like a pipe dream. So I really don't think you should take this card seriously unless... I mean, it's hard to advise picking it at any point in the draft, except at like a chaff point, and at that point, you know, how many of them are you going to get? So I don't think this card is worth taking seriously, but it does exist for anyone who wants to try to make it work. Then we've got Agency Outfitter. So this is the guy I mentioned earlier. Again, 6-mana 4/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you can fetch a Magnifying Glass and or Thinking Cap and put them onto the battlefield. So Magnifying Glass and Thinking Cap, so Magnifying Glass is a 3-mana, taps for colorless, and you can pay 4 and tap it to investigate. So, you know, a very slow way to make clues. And then Thinking Cap is a single colorless for an equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+2. You can equip to a detective for 1 or equip in general for 3. And this Agency Outfitter just lets you put them right onto the battlefield. So, you know, importantly, you can equip that Thinking Cap to the Outfitter. It becomes a 5/5. That Magnifying Glass can tap to put the Thinking Cap on the Outfitter. So if you have both the Magnifying Glass and the Thinking Cap, the Outfitter is immediately a 5/5, and then you can start, you know, investigating on the following turn. I think this generates just enough value to feel good to play. But the question is, so if this is in your sealed pool and you have the other options, you know, this is a very cool thing to consider. But in terms of draft, it's like, you know, I get the Agency Outfitter, and then when do I pick a Magnifying Glass and a Thinking Cap to try to make it work? It'll be a fun, interesting question to ask in Limited, and it's something to definitely keep an eye out for, because if you can make it happen, it's pretty solid. And yeah, that'll be it. So I'm very excited for Murders at Karlov Manor. I'm not big into the murder mystery thing, but I think this set looks really interesting mechanically, and I'm just excited to see how it plays. I'm excited to draft it with my friends at my wonderful local game store. I'm excited to do the pre-release. Hit me in the comments with, you know, is there a card you think was really important that I forgot to talk about? Is there a mechanic you're really excited to play with? An archetype you're really excited to experiment with? I want to hear what you're excited for with this set. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I've been War Crimes Uwu, a F&M draft grinder, and I love making this content. So feel free to hit it with a like, a subscribe, a comment. I love engaging with you guys and hearing what you have to say. And look out for more of these, maybe some more scripted content in the future. And I hope you all have a wonderful night.